Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The first photo I saw was of Matt holding a beer, shirt off, sunglasses tilted down his nose, one of those over-the-top tourist lays around his neck, with a caption that read, "Maui Madness begins." My first thought wasn't even confusion, it was habit. I tapped to see who had posted it, assuming maybe it was an old photo, maybe someone tagged wrong. But no, it was fresh. From 5 hours ago. A live update from my sister's Instagram story. In the background, clear as day, I saw my parents standing on the tarmac with huge grins and my mother clutching her straw hat like a damn movie star. It looked like one of those staged vacation photos you see in hotel brochures, except this one had my entire family in it. Except for me. They didn't tell me they were leaving. Not one word. No, hey Eli, we're going away for a bit. No, do you want to come with? Not even a courtesy, by the way, we're heading out of town. Just silence. Digital absence. The kind of silence that hums behind your ears and makes your stomach twist, because it's not just an oversight, it's a message. At first, I laughed. Out loud. The sound of it bounced off the walls of my apartment, too bright, too sudden, like I dropped a wine glass and watched it shatter, but couldn't quite believe it was real. I told myself maybe it was a work thing. Maybe Dad had won one of those company retreats again, the ones they do every other year. But then I saw another photo. A big dinner table by the beach, tiki torches lit, drinks flowing, and Matt holding court with a story that clearly had everyone doubled over. The caption this time read, "Best family trip ever." It was the word family that caught me like a fishhook in the gut. Because what the hell was I then? I scrolled for a while longer. I wasn't trying to punish myself. I just couldn't stop looking. The photos kept coming. My mom in oversized sunglasses holding a coconut. My dad and Sarah paddleboarding. Matt jumping off a cliff into the water while someone filmed from a drone. The captions were cheerful, full of inside jokes and hashtags, like the whole thing was a reward for surviving something hard. Except I hadn't been part of whatever that was. It wasn't even the trip that did it. It was the not knowing, the way nobody even thought to lie about it. Nobody threw me a bone. That silence spoke louder than a scream, and it said, "You don't matter enough to be included." So I stood there in the middle of my kitchen, phone in one hand, coffee going cold in the other, and I let the weight of it hit me. I didn't throw anything. I didn't text anyone. I didn't cry. I just felt it. And then I started packing. Not in a rage. Not like I was storming out. I packed like someone who finally understood something they'd spent years trying not to. I took the essentials first: birth certificate, passport, old photos I actually liked, my grandfather's watch, a knife I'd had since I was 17, and a little stack of cash I'd been saving without even knowing why. Then I grabbed clothes. Nothing fancy, just things that didn't wrinkle easy. I tossed in my worn notebook and 3 pens. My favorite hoodie. The boots I always meant to resole but never did. I didn't know where I was going yet. I just knew I wasn't staying. Every sound felt louder while I packed. The zipper of my duffel bag. The creak of the drawers. The hum of the fridge. Even my breathing. It was like the silence had amplified everything else, like it wanted to make sure I heard every step of my own leaving. Before I shut the door for good, I took one last walk through the apartment. Not to be sentimental, there was nothing sentimental about this place, but to make sure I hadn't left any part of myself behind. I took down the photo of me and Matt as kids, the one on the fridge. We were maybe 10 and 12, playing in the sprinkler in our backyard, mouths open, wild-eyed, laughing like we didn't know what sadness was yet. I almost left it. But something about that memory felt like a lie now, so I folded it once, then again, and tucked it in my back pocket. I didn't leave a note. Not at first. But as I stood there, bag in hand, I felt like I needed to mark the space somehow. So I grabbed a sticky note from the desk, wrote 5 words, and stuck it dead center on the kitchen counter. I finally get it. Bye. Have you ever had that moment? That sick, electric moment where the people who should love you the most remind you, without yelling, without fists, without cruelty, that you are optional, that your existence is not vital, not even convenient. Because here's the thing, you don't need to be screamed at to know you're not wanted. Sometimes it's the silence that crushes hardest. I took the long way out of town. I didn't check the GPS. I didn't call anyone. I just drove, window cracked, wind cutting across my arm like a wake-up slap. Somewhere outside the city limits, I threw my phone into a ditch. Just let it go. I figured if they wanted to find me badly enough, they could figure it out the old-fashioned way. But I knew they wouldn't. Not right away. Maybe not ever. Because people who forget you when they're happy rarely remember you when they're scared. And something deep in my chest finally said what I hadn't dared to think until that moment. Maybe they wouldn't even notice I was gone. And maybe that was the best part. It's strange how a family can be so loud and still manage to silence one of its own without ever raising a voice. That was the dynamic in our house growing up. Lots of movement, lots of laughter, plenty of yelling, but somehow I always felt like I was listening from the other room, even when I was standing right there. And in the middle of all that chaos stood Matt, our golden boy, the sun around which everything and everyone rotated, whether they wanted to or not. I used to think it was just birth order, that old myth about youngest kids being spoiled and oldest ones bearing the burden. But Matt wasn't spoiled in the traditional sense. He was chosen in every room, in every conversation, in every damned crisis. Matt was the kid who got suspended twice in high school, but still managed to have a crowd of family cheering at his graduation like he was valedictorian. He once crashed Mom's Buick into a parked truck while high on something that smelled like gasoline and bubblegum, but by the next day it had become a funny story. Boys will be boys, and he's just going through a phase. I drove out that night, picked him up from the police station, and paid the impound fee with cash I'd been saving to fix my brakes. Nobody thanked me. The car got fixed with money from the family fund. And 2 weeks later, Matt was back in the driver's seat like nothing had ever happened. Meanwhile, I kept showing up. For everything. I handled the insurance mess when Dad's policy got screwed up, made the calls, filled the forms, explained the terms like I worked for the damn company. When Sarah's husband walked out on her and left her with an apartment full of broken dishes and broken trust, I was the one who helped her move, built her IKEA furniture, listened to her cry while we ate takeout on the floor. I didn't mind, not really, because that's what you do for family, right? That's what I kept telling myself. But after a while, it started to feel like I was just the guy who cleaned up after the party that everyone else got to enjoy. Matt was charming, sure, but it wasn't just about that. He had this ability to make you believe he was worth the trouble. He'd smile at Mom like she was the only woman in the world, tell Dad what a legend he was, call Sarah the smartest girl I know, and somehow mean it in a way that made you forget he'd once left her stranded at a gas station because he got distracted talking to a girl. He had a magic trick for every person in our family, and they all fell for it every single time. I didn't have magic. I had consistency. I had punctuality. I had responsibility. You don't get applause for that. You just get expectations. I remember one time, maybe 10 years ago, we were all having dinner at my parents' house. Nothing special, just a Sunday evening. I'd made the lasagna, cleaned up the kitchen, brought over salad and drinks. We were sitting around the table and Matt was telling some story, something about a road trip with his college buddies that involved a bar fight, a missing shoe, and a girl named Destiny, and everyone was in stitches. I was halfway through my second glass of wine, nodding politely, trying to figure out if anyone had even noticed I was there, when Dad turned to me and said, with a grin, "Eli, you're like a good background character. You keep the plot moving without stealing the show." Everyone laughed. Even me. I laughed because it was easier than letting the truth of that sentence punch me in the throat. And the worst part was, he didn't mean it as an insult. He thought he was complimenting me. Steady. Reliable. Quiet. Forgettable. I didn't fight for attention growing up. Maybe that was my mistake. I figured if I just kept being useful, if I kept showing up, one day someone would turn around and realize I'd been holding the whole damn structure together with my bare hands. But it never happened. Instead, I became invisible by design. A fixture. The guy who answered the phone when no one else could be bothered. The one who remembered birthdays, paid parking tickets, checked the oil, fixed the Wi-Fi, drove mom to the doctor, picked up Sarah's kid when she had a meeting and stayed late to help dad file taxes. I was there for every small thing that nobody remembered later. But Matt, he could forget your birthday and still walk through the door with a six-pack and a dumb joke and somehow be forgiven before he even finished his sentence. And I used to tell myself I was okay with that. That I didn't need the spotlight. That being good was enough. But that lie started to rot from the inside. Because the truth is, you can be 1,000 kinds of good and still never be chosen. It didn't all come crashing down at once. It was death by 1,000 little cuts. Like when Sarah invited Matt to her kid's birthday party but told me she figured I'd be busy. Like when mom posted a throwback photo of Matt for #National Siblings Day and I wasn't in a single one. Like when dad told a story at Thanksgiving about his 2 kids, Matt and Sarah, and didn't even blink. It wasn't malicious. That's what made it worse. It was just instinctual. I was background noise to them. Necessary but unremarkable. Present but not seen. So when they left for Maui and didn't think to include me, not even out of obligation, it wasn't the beginning of something. It was the final note in a song I'd been humming for 30 years. The silence after a closing door. The last page of a book you already knew by heart. And somewhere in all that emptiness, I stopped trying to be good. Not because I turned bitter, but because I finally realized that good doesn't mean anything if nobody sees you. Good doesn't keep you warm. Good doesn't send postcards. Good doesn't get invited. Good just waits. And I was done waiting. There was no moment of rage, no flipping of furniture or shouting into mirrors, no drunken breakdown in the dark, just a long and deliberate stillness, like something inside me had finally run out of batteries. I didn't pack in a storm of emotion or slam the door behind me for dramatic effect. I moved through that apartment like I was cleaning up after someone else's life, wiping down surfaces and folding old shirts into neat piles, all while my mind was eerily clear, like I'd already left in some way, even though my body was still there. I didn't feel hatred. I didn't feel sadness, not yet. What I felt was closer to surrender, a quiet understanding that I wasn't needed, that the only thing tethering me to this life was my own refusal to admit the truth. The first thing I did was draft a resignation email that didn't say much at all, no dramatic exit speech, no list of grievances, just 2 lines and a thank you for the opportunity. I didn't expect a response and I didn't get one. The next morning, I unplugged the Wi-Fi router, wiped my old laptop clean, and dropped it off at the nearest donation center with the screen still warm. Then I walked into my cell phone provider and asked to cancel everything. They gave me a look like I was a man on the run, which, in a way, I guess I was. I told them I was moving abroad and didn't need a number anymore. That wasn't exactly true, but it was easier than explaining I just didn't want to be reachable, not by anyone who would only remember I existed when it suited them. The car went next. I sold it to a quiet guy who didn't ask many questions, paid in cash, and didn't blink when I handed over the keys without a hint of hesitation. That car had seen too much of me waiting outside houses, watching through windows, sitting quietly while other people made noise inside. I let it go like it was just another piece of furniture in a home that had never really been mine. The apartment took a little longer. I had to wait until the end of the month, so I didn't raise flags with the landlord. In the meantime, I spent each day sorting through my things with the kind of detachment people usually reserve for cleaning out the attic of a deceased relative. I kept only what fit in a single duffel bag, 2 changes of clothes, a warm coat, the journal I'd filled with bits of myself over the years, and a handful of old photographs I couldn't quite bring myself to throw away. I left behind the framed family pictures, the ones where I was half smiling beside Matt, always one step back, always on the edge of the frame like someone who just happened to be passing through. When the last of the boxes were gone, I stood in the empty apartment and listened to the hum of nothing. It's amazing how loud silence gets when you've stripped away all the distractions, when you don't even have a refrigerator buzz or a ticking clock to pull your mind elsewhere. I didn't cry. I thought maybe I would, but there were no tears left, not after everything had already dried up inside me. I found a pen and wrote the only words I felt were honest, stuck the note dead center on the counter where I knew someone would eventually see it. I finally get it. Enjoy your vacation. No name. No signature. Just 5 words that carried the weight of 3 decades of being overlooked, misunderstood, and quietly used. I didn't leave it to cause pain. I left it because it was the most peaceful thing I could say in a world where everything else had gone numb. Then I disappeared. I didn't tell Sarah. I didn't call mom or dad. I didn't send a text, post a cryptic message, or leave digital breadcrumbs for someone to follow. I slipped away in the slowest, softest way a person can, peeling myself from their lives like wallpaper in a room that nobody visits anymore. And the strangest part? Nobody noticed. Not at first. Maybe not for a long while. I bought a one-way bus ticket using cash, picked a town I'd never heard of, and rode through the night beside strangers who were all running from something or towards something or maybe both. No one asked my name. No one cared where I was going. And that felt more honest than anything I'd experienced in years. When I got off the bus, the air was different. It smelled like pine and cold dirt, and the sky had that kind of flat grayness that makes time feel like it's standing still. I found a cheap motel room with paper-thin walls and no working television. I stayed there for a week, maybe longer. Time started to stretch in strange directions once I wasn't being measured by anyone's expectations. I walked a lot during those first few days. Not to get anywhere, just to feel the ache in my legs and the crunch of gravel underfoot. I watched people from a distance, not out of paranoia but out of habit. I wrote in my journal every night, filling pages with thoughts I didn't know I had, fragments of memory that rose like ghosts from the floorboards. It's funny how quickly the world forgets you when you stop waving your arms for attention. The phone didn't ring. My emails stayed silent. My name didn't pop up in any posts or messages or missed calls. If anyone in my family realized I was gone, they didn't let it show. And in that silence, I found something I hadn't expected. I found a kind of peace, not the comforting, warm kind, but the hard, clean kind that comes after you've burned something down and stood in the ashes long enough to stop coughing. I didn't disappear to punish them. I disappeared because I needed to see if I existed outside their story. I needed to know if I could be more than the good son, the quiet helper, the one who never asked for anything in return. I needed to see if I could belong to myself. And so far, the answer was yes. When they came back, the air still thick with that smug post-vacation glow, sunburns peeling and laughter echoing through the terminal parking lot, none of them were prepared for how quiet the house felt without me. They were too busy unpacking lays and unpacking stories to even notice anything was off right away, too high on tropical drinks and shared inside jokes to feel the hollow shift in the air. It wasn't until Sarah asked if I'd stopped by to water the plants, offhand and barely listening to her own words, that anyone paused long enough to realize they hadn't heard from me in weeks. It started with Dad checking the kitchen counter for my usual notes, the ones I always left when I'd been by to fix something or drop off groceries or handle whatever small crisis they had going. No note. Just a thin layer of dust where mail usually sat, untouched. That's when Sarah noticed the mail was still stacked outside in the little metal box by the porch, crammed with catalogs, junk, a bill or 2 marked second notice, and a small envelope with no return address. Still, nobody panicked. Not yet. Matt was the first to break the silence, holding a drink in one hand and smirking like all of this was part of some elaborate inside joke he hadn't yet been let in on. Maybe he finally joined a cult, he said with a laugh, glancing around like someone was supposed to chuckle with him, Like the idea of me snapping and wandering into the desert in a white robe was somehow funny. But no one laughed, not even Mom, who usually let Matt's sarcasm slide like water off a raincoat. There was something in her face that changed just a little, barely enough to notice unless you knew her, unless you knew how tightly she kept her panic behind polite smiles and folded arms. They tried calling me, of course. One after the other, like some frantic little telephone tree had kicked into gear. First Sarah, then Mom, then Dad. Matt didn't bother. He just scrolled through his phone like maybe I'd posted something passive-aggressive while they were away, a status or meme that hinted at hurt feelings, something that would confirm they hadn't actually done anything wrong. But my number went straight to voicemail, no rings, no pickup, no reply. Email was the same. Texts undelivered. Instagram, Facebook, even LinkedIn, silent. Like I'd ghosted the entire internet. Like I had deliberately pulled every thread of myself out of the digital world they all lived in so comfortably. It was Sarah who finally drove to my apartment, still half expecting to see my car in the lot or the porch light left on like always. But when she got there, it looked abandoned. The windows were dark. The curtains were gone. The place looked stripped of personality, like a model unit waiting for a new tenant. She knocked, then banged. Then she called the landlord, half embarrassed, like maybe this was all a big misunderstanding she didn't want to admit to yet. But the landlord, a wiry old guy who'd rented to me for years without ever learning my last name, just shrugged and said he moved out about 2 weeks ago. Left the place spotless. No problems. Quiet guy. That was when the panic really began to creep in. Because nothing about me was ever abrupt. I didn't make sudden choices. I didn't forget birthdays or leave without folding the towels. I was the constant, the calendar reminder, the guy who mailed Christmas cards even when no one else remembered. For me to vanish wasn't just out of character, it was unnatural. Like someone had removed a piece of the puzzle and the image no longer made sense. It was Mom who found the photo. It was the next morning, when she was sorting through the pile of accumulated mail like it might offer some kind of clue, some hint at where I'd gone or why. Most of it was junk, pre-approved credit, coupon books, a flyer about roof repairs. But then there was the envelope. Small, thin, unmarked, no postage, just slid inside like someone had dropped it off by hand. Inside was a single glossy print. A photo from their Maui trip. The one where they were all standing on the beach, arms around each other, the sun setting behind them like a postcard. But I was in the picture. I hadn't been there, of course. But I was there now. My face, perfectly cut and pasted in, standing slightly behind them all. No smile. No expression. Just staring straight ahead, like I was looking through the lens and out the other side. Whoever had done the editing had taken their time. My skin tone matched, the shadows fell the right way, even the grain was consistent. It was flawless, eerie, and deeply wrong. Mom stared at it for a long time before handing it to Dad without saying a word. His face turned the color of unshaken milk. Sarah muttered something about it being a prank. But Matt, for once, didn't say anything at all. His jaw clenched, and he looked away like he'd seen something he didn't want to admit was real. No note. No message. Just that image, a quiet haunting and high resolution. A reminder that I had seen everything, that I had watched from a distance, even if they hadn't noticed. That was when the mood shifted completely. The jokes dried up. The excuses began to unravel. And all that was left was the growing, gnawing realization that maybe I hadn't just taken a break, hadn't just gone off the grid for some dramatic timeout. Maybe I had left, really left, not out of spite, not to punish, but because I had finally accepted a truth none of them were ready to confront. That in their happiest moment, in their most joyful, shared memory, they had forgotten me so completely, that I had become nothing more than a ghost with scissors and glue. And now that ghost had disappeared. There's a kind of silence that feels heavier than a scream, the kind that settles across a family like fog after a car crash, thick and disorienting and filled with things no one wants to say out loud. That was the air inside the house now, too quiet, too still, like they were all waiting for a phone call they didn't want to answer. The photo had done something to them, more than any note or voicemail or angry letter could have. It forced them to see what they hadn't wanted to look at for years, that I had been watching, that I had been aware, and that I was done pretending it didn't hurt. It didn't take long before the blame started bouncing around like a pinball, hot and sharp and desperate. Mom was the first to break, standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed so tight across her chest you'd think she was trying to hold herself together. She pointed at Dad, voice tight with that brittle tone people use when they're pretending they're not yelling. "You always pushed him too hard," she said, like she'd been holding onto the sentence for years and now couldn't keep it in any longer. "You never made him feel like he was enough. You only had room for Matt's messes and Sarah's drama, and you treated Eli like a utility." Dad didn't take that quietly, of course not. He shot back with that familiar mix of wounded pride and misplaced confidence, saying, "Don't put this on me." He was always so withdrawn, like he wanted to be forgotten. I was just giving him space. If anyone pushed him away, it was Sarah, always dumping her problems on him like he was her emotional janitor. Sarah's mouth dropped open like someone had slapped her, and in a way, maybe they had. She pointed a shaking finger toward Matt, like she'd just realized something important. "You're the one who always needed saving," she snapped. "Every time you messed up, Eli cleaned it up. Do you even remember when he gave up his college fund for your rehab?" "I do. He was supposed to go to Boston. Had an acceptance letter and everything. But no, you OD'd in the garage, and everyone suddenly decided Eli didn't need a future as badly as you needed a second chance." Matt scoffed, that same arrogant sound he always made when he felt cornered but didn't want to admit it. He leaned back in the chair, arms crossed behind his head like this was all beneath him. "Come on," he said, half laughing, half sneering. "He's not dead, he's just pulling a stunt. He's always been sensitive. This is just his way of punishing us for not babysitting his feelings." But even Matt didn't believe it, not really. You could see it in the way his leg bounced under the table, the way he kept glancing at the door like I might come walking in just to prove him wrong. The bravado was just that, a mask, cracking at the edges. They didn't talk about me like I was missing. They talked about me like I was suddenly visible for the first time, like a ghost had finally decided to sit at the dinner table and speak up. And the more they talked, the more they started remembering the things they'd buried, the small kindnesses that had added up to something enormous, even if they'd never noticed it before. Mom remembered the time I spent 3 straight nights sleeping on her couch when she had that flu and couldn't keep anything down. She hadn't asked me to stay. I just showed up, brought soup, kept the place clean, and sat with her in the dark between coughing fits, quiet as a shadow. She hadn't mentioned it once since. But now it came tumbling out like confession. Dad sat silently as Sarah listed every time I'd fix something without being asked: the deck, the water heater, the time the pipes froze, and I crawled under the house with a heat gun and a flashlight while everyone else stayed warm inside. I didn't ask for thanks, and I didn't get it either. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. But now, listening to them speak, maybe they were starting to realize how much it actually did. Sarah, who had leaned on me the hardest, started crying. Not loud sobs, just quiet tears that slid down her cheeks while she stared at the floor, her hands twisting in her lap like she was trying to wring the guilt out through her fingers. "I used to call him instead of a therapist," she said softly, the words trembling. "He never told me no, even when he should have. I thought he was okay because he always showed up. That's the part that gets you. The showing up. People think because you keep showing up, it means you're fine. It means you're strong. It means you can handle more. But what it really means is you've been trained to believe your own needs are less important than the peace of the people around you. And once that belief sets in, it takes years to untangle it. Sometimes you never do." They were trying now, in their own messy ways, to piece together the version of me they had ignored. It was like they were reconstructing a portrait from scraps, a gesture here, a memory there, and only now realizing they'd never actually looked at the full picture before. And the guilt, that heavy guilt, it hung in the room like humidity, pressing on their chests, making every breath feel like an apology waiting to be spoken. But here's the thing about guilt. It's not healing. It's not redemption. It's just the echo of understanding that came too late. It can't call someone back who's already decided they've had enough. It can't undo the 1,000 tiny wounds that were never acknowledged because they didn't bleed loudly enough. I wasn't there to hear them fight, to watch them turn on each other like dogs around an empty bowl. But I didn't need to be, because guilt is a ghost that doesn't wait for permission. It visits when the lights are out, when the phones are silent, when the photos start looking more like evidence than memories. And now, in the stillness they had never made space for before, they finally began to understand what I had known for years, that being forgotten isn't always about someone not remembering you. Sometimes, it's about them never seeing you to begin with. It was Sarah who finally snapped under the weight of not knowing, her anxiety gnawing at her like a dog with a bone, unable to sit still with the idea that I was simply gone without explanation, without a trace that pointed towards safety or danger or anything in between. She didn't tell the rest of the family at first, didn't sit them down with some dramatic speech or gather consensus. She just quietly called a private investigator one afternoon, scrolling through Google with shaking hands and a half-cold cup of coffee beside her, the kind of act you do when you're afraid you waited too long to ask the right questions. The man she hired wasn't flashy, no trench coat, no fedora, none of that television stuff. His name was Fletcher, middle-aged, thin voice, eyes like dried-up wells. He asked questions that made her uncomfortable, questions she didn't want to answer, questions that made her realize how little any of them had actually known about my life in the first place. Where did I bank? Who were my friends? What was my daily routine, my favorite places, my patterns? And the truth, once she heard herself speak it out loud, was embarrassing. She didn't know. Not really. They all just assumed I'd always be where I'd always been, quiet, reliable, a man of habits who made himself easy to ignore because that was what I thought love looked like. But Fletcher did what he was paid to do. He started digging through paper trails and surveillance footage, checking bus station logs and ATM withdrawals, looking for the ghost I'd become. It didn't take long before he found the first breadcrumb, a pawn shop receipt in my name from a place 3 towns over. I'd sold a wristwatch, the old Seiko that belonged to our grandfather, the one Dad gave me on my 20th birthday without ceremony, like he was handing off a sandwich. Sarah didn't even know I still had it. The idea that I'd sold something with sentimental value shook her more than she admitted. But Fletcher didn't blink. He was used to ghosts shedding their skins before vanishing into smaller lives. Next came the bus ticket, purchased in cash at a Greyhound station in the middle of the night, one way to Santa Fe, no return trip, no ID required. The timestamp put me about 2 days after they'd returned from Maui, meaning I hadn't just disappeared, I'd waited. Maybe I wanted to see if someone would notice. Maybe I gave them a window to reach out. Maybe I was foolish enough to believe they still might. But no one came looking, so I kept going. There was a blurry security camera image from a gas station in Nevada. Just a silhouette really tall, head down, baseball cap pulled low, shoulders hunched in the posture of someone who doesn't want to be seen. You couldn't even tell if it was me, but Sarah said she knew, said it was in the way I walked, the way I kept my hands in my pockets, the tilt of my head. It was strange, realizing how people who never bothered to look closely when you were right in front of them suddenly become experts at spotting you once you've disappeared. Despite the leads, Fletcher kept coming up against dead ends. No phone usage, no banking activity, no social media. I had erased myself with a precision that made even him uneasy. He told Sarah that most people trying to vanish don't do it clean. They leave messes, mistakes, digital footprints. They call someone late at night when the silence gets too loud. They check their email out of habit or try to see if anyone misses them online. But not me. Fletcher said I'd disappeared like someone who meant it. The family didn't handle it well. Dad started drinking again, not in that cartoonish, fall-down kind of way, but quietly, with late-night sips and early morning breath that smelled like regret. Mom busied herself with meaningless errands, buying groceries they didn't need, organizing closets that had already been emptied, folding towels that didn't need folding. Matt, for all his bravado, stopped sleeping through the night. He told Sarah he was having dreams, strange ones, always the same, me standing at the edge of a cliff, not jumping, just watching him without saying a word. And then the postcard came. It arrived on a Wednesday, addressed to the family house in Mom's handwriting, the kind she used to use when sending out Christmas cards. No return address. No city listed, just a postmark from a small town in southern Alaska that none of them had ever heard of. The front was a photo of a mountain, snow-covered, jagged, bleak in that beautiful kind of way that makes you feel small and clean. On the back, in simple black ink, was a single sentence. "You never saw me. That's the point." No signature. No date. Just that sentence, clean and final, like a closing door that doesn't slam but still locks tight behind you. Sarah stared at it for almost an hour before handing it over to Mom, whose hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped it. Dad read it once and didn't say a word. He just folded it in half and placed it on the mantel, as if proximity to the fireplace might warm it into something less painful. Matt didn't read it at all. He stood there, arms crossed, jaw clenched, eyes glassy, like if he didn't read the words, they couldn't be real. Like denial might still be an option. But deep down, they all knew. They knew I wasn't missing. I was gone. There's a difference. Missing means there's a chance, a door still cracked, a thread to pull. Gone means someone made a choice. Gone means they looked at everything that once kept them tethered and decided it was better to float free, to become a ghost in the eyes of people who never truly saw them to begin with. The postcard didn't ask them to understand. It didn't demand forgiveness or promise a return. It was a message, yes, but more than that, it was a mirror. One that showed them the cost of their blindness, the emptiness their indifference had carved over years of selective love and transactional affection. And the worst part wasn't the message itself. It was the knowledge that, somewhere in Alaska, in a place too far to reach and too cold to romanticize, I had found peace in invisibility. And they had to sit with the crushing truth that they had driven me there. The silence here isn't like the silence I used to live with, the kind that sat in the corners of family dinners or crawled between sentences when I waited for someone to ask how I was doing and they never did. No, this silence is something entirely different. It's earned. It's deliberate. It's mine. Out here, in this weather-worn cabin tucked between a thick stretch of pine trees and a frozen lake that doesn't thaw until May, the stillness wraps around me like a second skin. There's no hum of electronics, no buzz from passing traffic, no faint television chatter bleeding through apartment walls. Just snow falling like soft ash, and the crackling of the fire I keep feeding with whatever dry wood I can haul in from the shed. It's been nearly 3 months since I left. Maybe more. I stopped counting after the second week. Time slips differently out here. It doesn't march in straight lines anymore. It drifts. Days pass like clouds, some bright, some gray, most forgettable. The only time I really notice the days stacking up is when I catch my reflection in the dusty mirror nailed above the sink and see how my beard's grown, how my eyes look clearer even though they've been crying less. I'm not angry. People expect anger when someone disappears, when they walk out on their family or their life or whatever identity the world hung around their neck like a leash. But anger is exhausting, and it never fit me anyway. I used to think I was just conflict-averse, that I avoided confrontation because it was easier, cleaner. But out here, I've started to realize that wasn't it at all. I didn't avoid conflict because I was weak. I avoided it because I had learned, again and again, that when I spoke, no one listened. That when I raised my voice, it echoed back at me hollow, like shouting into a canyon where the only reply is your own fear screaming back. Out here, no one interrupts me. No one corrects my version of events. No one rewrites my memories in real time. I've started talking to myself again, not out of madness, but out of a need to hear a voice that isn't laced with judgment or dismissal. I walk the perimeter of the woods some mornings, snow crunching under boots that were secondhand when I bought them, whispering truths I never said aloud before. It feels strange, but not stupid. It feels like pulling splinters out after years of pretending they weren't there. Some nights I sit by the fire and reread the postcard I never sent, the one I wrote the day after I arrived here. I folded it into the back of my journal, unfinished and unsent, not because I didn't mean it, but because I wasn't sure they deserved to receive it. The handwriting is uneven, pressed too hard into the paper, like I was trying to make sure the weight of what I felt couldn't be erased. It reads, "What does it mean when you give your whole self to people and they act like you never existed? Is disappearing revenge or surrender?" That's the question that keeps circling me like smoke. I didn't leave because I wanted them to hurt. I left because I needed to stop hurting. There's a difference. But even now, sitting in this solitude I carved out of snow and silence, I still wonder if my leaving was more than just escape. Was it a message buried inside a disappearance? And if so, who was it really for? I keep going back to moments I hadn't thought about in years. Tiny, forgettable things that felt meaningless at the time, but now play like warning bells I ignored. Like when I drove Sarah home after her third miscarriage, and she stared out the window the whole time, never saying thank you. Or the time Matt lost his job, and I sent him money to cover rent, and he used it to buy a new watch instead. He sent me a photo of it with the caption, "Finally something decent," as if I was supposed to be proud. I remember every Christmas I spent alone in that kitchen, making dinner while the others drank and laughed in the living room, tossing half-hearted offers to help that they never intended to follow through on. I remember birthdays where I was told, "We'll do something next weekend," and weekends that came and went with no plans. I remember the way Dad once looked right through me during a family meeting, asking, "Where's Eli?" while I was sitting in the same goddamn room. What was I to them? That's the question I can't let go of, the one that follows me through the trees like a shadow that won't thaw in the sun. Was I a brother? A son? A placeholder? Was I a stand-in for emotional labor they didn't want to carry themselves? Was I the emotional sponge, the soft landing, the one who took the blame just so the ship could keep sailing? Or was I just convenient? There's a comfort in being needed, but there's a poison in being needed only for what you provide. Out here, there's no one to need me, and in that absence, I'm learning who I am without obligation. I am quieter, slower, not healed, but healing, not whole, but solid. Some mornings I wake up with a lump in my throat and no one to tell. Some nights I still imagine someone knocking on the door, face frozen from the cold, voice trembling as they say, "We didn't realize." But they don't come. And I think that's the point. I left so they would notice. Not just that I was gone, but that I had been there all along. I wanted them to look at the shape of the absence and recognize the body that used to fill it. And maybe they did. Maybe they've sat with that realization in the same way I sit with my own truths now, slow and uncomfortable and filled with questions no one can answer. I don't know if I'll ever go back. Not because I hate them, but because I don't know if I could trust myself not to fall back into the same quiet, grateful shadow I spent so long pretending was a real person. I would rather be alone in a cabin with snow at my door and smoke in my lungs than be present in a room where I don't exist. I still have that postcard. I keep it folded next to the firewood list I make every week, a reminder of what I once felt and what I might still feel again. And when I read it, I don't think about them. I think about the version of myself who wrote it, the man who was brave enough to vanish so he could be real for the first time. And I wonder if that was surrender, or the beginning of something I should have done a long time ago. It was Sarah who pushed hardest for them to go, her voice trembling with the weight of decisions made too late, guilt pulling at her spine like a chain she couldn't snap, but still she carried it forward. After the postcard from Alaska arrived, something in the family finally shifted, something real, something raw. It wasn't spoken outright, but there was a mutual understanding now, unspoken but heavy. This wasn't just a disappearance. This was a reckoning. And so, with barely coordinated plans and bags packed in guilt instead of excitement, they flew north. Not for a vacation, not for a reunion they were sure of, but for something more desperate, proof that he still existed somewhere in the frostbite of their mistakes. They didn't even know where to start looking at first. The postmark had been vague, and Alaska wasn't a small place. But Sarah, driven by something primal and maybe a little bit selfish, found the town by cross-referencing the stamp with a delivery route she traced on a logistics map online. It was a remote place, not a tourist destination, not the kind of spot you stumble into by accident. No hotels, just a diner, a gas station, and a weather-worn general store where the windows seemed more fogged from time than cold. They asked questions, flashing a photo of Eli they had printed at the airport, the same one they hadn't looked closely at for years. He was smiling, young, too hopeful for what had come after. The woman at the diner was the first to say she'd seen him. She pointed toward the woods, toward the old hunting trail where the snow didn't settle quite right, like the trees themselves kept the cold from digging too deep. "Cabin out there," she said. "Belongs to no one. He's been there a while. Quiet guy. Didn't say much." They followed her directions through half-plowed roads and silence that made their ears ring, the kind of silence that demanded something in return. When they reached the cabin, it looked exactly like what they expected, which is to say it looked like nothing. A slouching roof, smokeless chimney, windows blurred with condensation, the door closed but not locked. Sarah hesitated before stepping in, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her regret, but finally, she turned the knob and walked inside. It was not what they expected. The first thing they noticed was the heat. The fire had burned recently, the air still held warmth, as if someone had stepped out not hours ago. The kettle on the stove was empty but still warm to the touch. It was not the home of someone long gone. It was the pause between one moment and the next. They called his name, softly at first, then louder, not shouting exactly, but with the kind of urgency that comes when you fear the walls might answer back. But no one came. No footsteps on snow. No creak of floorboards. Just the quiet hum of absence and a stillness that now felt too purposeful. Then Matt saw the wall. Photos, dozens of them, pinned and taped and tacked in crooked lines and overlapping edges, old snapshots from their childhood, their family gatherings, birthdays, holidays, even one of Eli helping Sarah build a bookshelf, holding the hammer with his awkward, sideways grin. But every photo had been marked, altered in some small and some not-so-small way. Eli's face had been scratched out in many, a streak of pen or a cut of knife across the face he never liked seeing in pictures anyway. In others, it was the rest of the family who had been defaced, faces blurred with charcoal or torn at the edges like unfinished puzzles. It wasn't violent, exactly. It was something colder. A rewriting. An erasure not of anger, but of clarity. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for one of the photos, an old Christmas morning shot with Matt holding a video game controller and Eli in the background, half cropped out. Only now, he'd been cut away completely, as if his own memory didn't want to exist there anymore. On the table beside the wood stove sat a journal, open to a page halfway through, a smudge of ash near the spine. The handwriting was familiar, tight, controlled, always pressing too hard into the page like he didn't trust ink to be loud enough. The words were short, but they shattered whatever hope had still clung to their coats. "You came too late. Maybe next lifetime." No signature. No date. No other pages torn out. Just that. The kind of message that isn't meant to be a goodbye, but a boundary. A line drawn in permanent ink. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, just reading those words again and again as if saying them out loud might change their meaning. He was gone. Not missing. Not hiding. Not waiting to be rescued. Gone. No footprints in the snow led away from the cabin, but the wind had picked up, and Alaska has a way of stealing evidence from the earth. Still, Matt stepped outside and looked toward the tree lean, his eyes scanning for movement he couldn't explain, perhaps hoping to see his brother watching, just out of view, deciding whether they were finally worth stepping back into the world for. But there was no movement. No shadow. Just trees and sky and cold. They stayed the night in town, not because they thought he'd return, but because leaving immediately felt like admitting something they still weren't ready to say out loud. Over dinner at the diner, no one spoke. The food tasted like paper, every bite forced. The next morning, they boarded their flight and returned to the warmth of their lives, their offices, their errands, their routines, but nothing felt the same. Eli didn't haunt them with presence, but with absence. It was the empty seat at the table, the phone that didn't ring, the holidays that came with fewer chairs. It was the guilt that didn't shout but whispered, constantly, like a breath on the back of the neck. They didn't talk much about the trip afterward. They each held their own version of it, like a scar they didn't want to admit was self-inflicted. Sarah sometimes dreamt of him, standing at the lake, looking older, calmer, unreachable. Mom started writing letters she never sent, folded neatly into a box in the back of her closet. Dad, for once, stopped pretending he had all the answers. And Matt? He tried to move on, but even his laughter started sounding like something borrowed, like it belonged to a man he no longer recognized in the mirror. They didn't know if he was alive. They didn't know if he'd ever return. But the question that haunted them more than any of that was the one they never dared to say aloud. Had they ever truly known Eli at all? And if not, who exactly had they lost? Was he right to disappear? Or had he, somewhere in the snow, become the villain in the story of his own escape?